Hello and welcome. Tonight we are going to be reading ghost stories. And we will be reading them from the website Your Ghost Stories, where people share their first-hand paranormal experiences. Up until now, in previous episodes, we've been reading stories according to a determined theme. But tonight we will be following no specific theme, and we'll discuss a variety of topics following each account. At the end, I'll also be sharing a personal spooky experience of my own. As always, these are not your average ghost stories, but they are interesting and they are strange, and they come from a variety of cultures. So, let's get started with our first story by user Dark Colored Glasses in California. It's called Woman Standing in Front of My House. It's almost midnight, and I'm on my couch enjoying an episode of Friends. Once the credits start to roll, I check the time on my phone and it says 11:57 a.m. I get up and step onto my front porch to look at the moon when I get this uneasy feeling. I can't describe it any better than uneasy. Weird, like being watched. So I look around my block and something standing on the sidewalk on the other side of the street gets my attention. It appears to be a woman dressed in black, but the more I stare at her, the weirder it becomes. I stand on my porch for anywhere between 10 and 15 seconds, staring right at it, her, whatever it was, pinching myself, because I want to make sure that this is not a figment of my imagination, and I suddenly get this rush of fear. So I open my metal screen door and stand inside my house, staring at whatever it was through the door. Let me describe this person/thing. It appears to be a woman, maybe 5 foot 2 inches, and sort of pudgy. She's wearing a black skirt that reaches under her knees, a black sweater, black, flat, old womanly shoes, and a veil that covers her head, but I can't see any hair or neck. I continue to stand there for about a minute, and I cannot look away, but I am terrified because this person looks so out of place, especially with the veil, and I notice that they don't appear to move. Normally, when someone stands, they don't stand up completely straight without shifting or moving around to balance their weight. But this thing just stands there with its back as straight as a board. The only light outside comes from various streetlights, and the house this thing stands in front of has all the lights off, minus the soft blue glow of a TV that is visible through the front window. There are no cars or people walking. It's a dead end and we don't get a lot of traffic, especially at 12 o'clock at night. And as the noise of the nearby freeway somehow drowns out, everything gets weirder. I don't feel any wind. I don't hear any noise. It feels like everything else is paused, and it's just me and this thing, and I feel scared again. Because of the veil she's wearing, I can't tell whether it's facing me or looking away, but I do feel like I'm being watched. I try to focus on her legs and shoes, but I simply cannot make out whether I'm looking at her front or her back. I almost yell for my brother, but I get this weird idea. What if it hears me, and it shows me something I don't want to see? I run to my brother's room, and I tell him to come to the door with me. We run back, but when we arrive, nobody is there, and everything is back to normal. We step outside and there are no cars, no people, nobody walking on the street. It seems like she simply vanished. My neighbor who owns the house it was standing near mentioned that someone has been leaving weird items, like bags with meat and hair inside. We looked at people's faces for communicatory clues. By reading their expression, we can try and assess if they are friendly or if they are aggressive or otherwise a threat. When we can't see their face, it automatically unsettles us because we can't gather these clues. This is why masks, veils, or long hair covering a person's face are so unsettling to us and are implemented as a scare tactic in horror movies and other media intended to give us the willies. The same goes for what the authors said about the woman standing completely, perfectly still. Not only is it unnatural, as they said, for someone to have no movement whatsoever, we are also unable to read their body language. You might start thinking, as dark-colored glasses did, that they may not be a person at all. I loved this story for its creepy and descriptive imagery, and the ending line about the bags of hair and meat was a bizarre twist. Whether it's a legitimate experience or not, and whether or not it is supernatural, is, of course, up to you. But I thought it was a fun and creepy way to get us started. Let's move on to our next story. This one comes from Brunei, and it is written by Miss Lioness. It's called The Guardians of the Seven Lakes. This story is from a real-life experience by my own mother when she was just a teenager. My mother, along with her father, oldest brother, and two of her female cousins, were trekking the jungles of Taysek Maradoon forests. They walked for about an hour or so, since her father did not want to go very deep into the jungle. After a while, they found a lake. It wasn't very large, and the water was a deep green color. My grandfather decided to take a break, and they all sat down on the logs or the dry leaves near the lake. My mother and her two cousins, Rana and Lana, chose to sit on a log that looked like it hovered on the lake, but it was steady enough to hold the three of them. As they chatted, Cousin Rana tapped her hands in a rhythm absent-mindedly on the log she was sitting on. She realized that the log felt a little damp and looked down. It looked like it was covered in a mucus. She called for Lana and my mother's attention, and they were all puzzled as to what was coating the log. That was when my mother looked behind her and realized that it was not a log at all. It was the body of a giant snake whose head was snuggled under the water. They could see the slits of its eyes, and they all froze because they did not want to wake it up. My mother said it looked nothing like an anaconda, and it was gigantic. My grandfather and my uncle, who were sitting down with their backs to them, were oblivious. The three of them did not know what to do. If they shouted, they might wake up the beast. If they just stood there, it might wake up eventually, so they tried to walk backwards, slowly. Then Rana stepped on a fallen branch. They saw the eyes begin to open and didn't wait for another second. They all screamed, surprising my grandfather and my uncle, then ran like their lives depended on it, leaving behind their hiking gear without a second thought. When they finally reached home, they told my mother's grandfather about it. He just shook his head as though he were amused by their story. He told them about the 7 lakes that resided along the jungles of Taysek Maradoon, which are each guarded by a penungu, which translates from my language as supernatural guardian. According to my great-grandfather, it seems they had stumbled upon one that day, but fortunately it didn't harm them, perhaps because they didn't do anything wrong. Not a ghost story, right? However, I found the story to be culturally fascinating and rich. Even the name of the story, The Guardian of the 7 Lakes, is beautiful and fantastical. Brunei is a country in Southeast Asia, located on the north coast of Borneo. The population is 70% Malays people, whose folklore we just discussed in a previous episode on goblins. This small coastal country is covered in lush wilderness and dotted by several rainforests. The forest that the author mentioned hiking through, Tasak Maradun, is a remote region of forest known for its scattered waterfalls and lakes. It is home to several legends, one of which is that of a fairy princess who dwells in a cave and comes to bathe in the waters of the Tasak Maradun. She is guarded by a sawang harimau, or a were-tiger, that paces near the edge of the water where the princess bathes. I did not find any references to legends involving giant snakes in this area. However, there are stories of ancient giant snakes in the nearby Malaysian state of Sarawak. They are called nabau and are believed to be gods who bring luck to any who lay eyes on them. But they were said to have turned to stone after having to nest outside, as no hole in the earth could house their sheer size. There's even a tourist attraction called Batu Nabau, which is a large rock shaped like a snake that locals believe to be one of these ancient deities, protecting the area and granting wishes. The grandfather in the story we read refers to the giant snake they saw as an ancient guardian, or a panungu. While I couldn't find any information in English specific to panungus, they seem to be a type of tutelary deity, which is a spirit or god that protects a particular place. There are no anacondas in Brunei. They only inhabit South America, but there are reticulated pythons, which have been known to grow up to 21 feet and weigh 160 pounds. Next, we are headed to Florida in a tale by Oksana called Orange Eyes. My first experience with the paranormal happened when I was 5 or 6 years old and living in Florida with my family. I am 48 years old now, and this one experience is so etched in my memory that when I recall it today, it is still as clear as if it had happened to me a few moments ago. We lived on a cattle ranch, not far from Bushnell, Florida. At that time, in the 60s, there were no streetlights on the ranch. Just a gravel road across cattle gates to our small, isolated ranch house in the pasture. I remember going to the screened-in back door that night and seeing my mother standing in the square of light cast from our kitchen through the door and onto the yard. She was raking out scraps for our dogs into their pan. She saw I was at the door and asked me to bring the flashlight that always sat on our kitchen counter. I took the flashlight to her without even a question in my mind. She cast a beam of light down into the dark pasture where I could see 2 orange eyes faintly glowing in the dark. "What is it, Mama?" I remember asking, and she replied that she had been watching the eyes for a little while. She thought it might be a cow at first, but the eyes were too close to the ground. We watched as the eyes started down the pasture towards some large trees that grew at the side of our house. The eyes didn't move like cow eyes in a slow, plodding way, but smoothly, more like a bird in my mind. They remained close to the ground and always watching us with their orange glow. It glided smoothly to a huge live oak tree that grew maybe 25 feet from our house. Then the eyes did the strangest thing. They turned parallel to the tree's trunk and glided up the side of the tree for about 15 feet, disappeared around the back of the huge trunk, and then out onto the first branch that grew on the opposite side of the tree. I remember my mama saying, "That's no cow," softly, as she traced the flashlight beam along the limb underneath the eyes. The beam caught no sign of fur or feet of any kind, just empty blackness, like the night. The eyes disappeared into a large clump of leaves at the end of the branch. My mama and I ran through the back door, through the house, and out onto our front porch. My daddy was sitting on the couch with the younger children watching a comedy on television. Daddy said, "What is it?" My mama and I said almost at the same time, "There's something in the pasture." Before we ran out onto the porch, we stood in the light cast from the front door and watched the end of the tree branch bouncing up and down wildly in the flashlight beam. Daddy was trying to corral the younger children back from the door. I remember turning around to see what he was doing, and when I turned back, the moon had started to rise over the flat Florida landscape, casting a bluish glow. Now we could see without aid from the flashlight. The branch bounced up and down. I remember the rustle of leaves, and a curious smell came to me on the night air, like burning wood. The branch stopped bouncing because the owner of the eyes had jumped out of the tree and out onto the gravel road in front of our house. For a moment, it was obscured by the hanging, still slightly bouncing clump of leaves, and then it started to move down the road in front of our house. The moon showed the owner of the orange glowing eyes, glowing more brightly now in the moonlight. It was no cow, for whatever it was, stood on two spindly legs, like animal legs, that ended in two thin, narrow hooves. From the legs upward was a huge body with no discernible arms and a hump of a head with two very long, straight horns that curved slightly upward at the ends. The entire body was pitch black and at least 6 feet tall, from hoof to horn end, the only color being the bright orange eyes. This thing hopped on its two legs down the road. I could hear the shifting crunch of gravel and see blue sparks fly up as its feet came back down on the road. My mama and I, accompanied by my daddy, piled into the house and slammed the door. We were breathing as if we'd run a race. My daddy, from his position with his back against the door, said breathlessly, "That's a plat-eye. There's treasure buried near that tree." I didn't understand then, but years later, I discovered exactly what a plat-eye is. In Southern legend, plat-eyes are the ghosts of murdered animals that are set to guard hidden treasure by living humans. Daddy never dug around the tree to see if there was hidden treasure, believing whatever treasure there might have been was cursed. This has to be one of my favorite stories I've ever found on Your Ghost Stories. It is told so vividly and brings up some folklore I was unfamiliar with until reading it. The author, Oksana, chimed in once again in the comments section to elaborate a bit more on the legend of the plat-eye. Before I read her comment, I do want to mention a word that comes up several times. The word is haint, H-A-I-N-T, and it is a Southern colloquialism that refers to specific types of spirits, which I'll explain more later. For now, just think of it as another word for ghost. Oksana writes, quote, "As regards to the plat-eye, it seems to be a truly Southern type of haint and is often told in African American stories about the paranormal. My daddy had seen one other plat-eye in his life. When he was young and living in Hardin County, Tennessee, this plat-eye guarded a bridge over a small creek near his home. He said he was coming home late one night and was crossing the bridge when this huge cat-shaped animal with just one, large red glowing eye blocked his way. He said he was so scared that he forded the creek some ways down from the bridge, and when he got home, told his mama about the creature. She was the one who explained to him what a plat-eye is. In the South, these types of creatures and other haints are associated with nature and are quite common, especially from my parents' generation and before. My mama and daddy told many stories when I was growing up about various types of haunted places. Not so much houses, but fields and woods and yards. I haven't encountered another plat-eye in my time since that one in Florida. We moved away from Florida when I was 10, so I don't know if the plat-eye still guards his treasure around the tree. I've been back one time to that ranch house since I became an adult in the late 70s. It surprised me how small the house was and how large the trees were. How isolated that place was with its little patch of yard fenced in with barbed wire to keep the cattle out. I don't know if it's still there or not, but someday I would like to go back again. Maybe rent the house for a month or so and stare out the window at night to see what I can see." End quote. Both the terms plat-eye and haint come from the culture of the Gullah people, an ethnic group originating from various parts of Africa and now residing predominantly in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Those who became known as the Gullah or Geechee were forcibly brought to the United States through the slave trade in the 18th century. Through the atrocity of slavery and human captivity, and the perseverance of those who suffered unimaginable and inhumane treatment through generations, a deeply rich and beautiful culture was formed, and remains a prominent part of the American Low Country, in a community of some 200,000. Notable aspects of Gullah culture are their flavorful cuisine of rice-based dishes, handcrafted sweetgrass baskets, and their beliefs regarding the supernatural. There are many Gullah traditions concerning witchcraft, the afterlife, and the paranormal. Haint is a word created by Gullah peoples that broadly encompasses any type of spirit or otherworldly being that means to cause misfortune or do harm to living people. They could be a sort of evil witch, known as boo-hags to the Gullahs, a demon, or a poltergeist. Plat-eyes are also considered a type of haint. The story goes that greedy Confederate landowners would bury their riches in forest or swamps to hide it, and would behead one of their slaves and bury them alongside the treasure to produce a plat-eye, a tormented spirit bound to protect the buried treasure. Plat-eye are sometimes seen as humanoid, and other times they take on the form of various animals. But no matter what form they take, their appearance is always off, as if they are trying to take on a particular form, but they didn't quite get it right. And as a result, they look distorted. They are shapeshifters and can take on different forms in rapid succession. But they always have one uniform characteristic feature: their large, glowing red or orange eyes, big and round as a plate. Plat-eye is actually just a shortened form of plate-eye. Before we move on, I'll read one more comment under the story Orange Eyes, where someone recounts a second-hand story of a plat-eye. Bet31 writes, quote, "I have only heard stories about a plat-eye from my fiancé. Some of his family lives in Pawleys Island, South Carolina. Him and his cousins were always told not to talk to one because they would follow you home. One of his cousins came across one sitting in a tree not far from his aunt's house. He was walking down the dirt road and heard something say, 'Hey man, where you going?'
Hey man, where you going?"
He didn't say anything to it, and it jumped down onto the road and asked him again. He immediately turned and ran back to his aunt's house. I find it interesting that your father described it looking pretty much the same way as my fiancé. Maybe there is something to it." End quote. For our final story of the night, I'm going to share an experience of my own. I'm not claiming it to be a ghost story, and it may not even be supernatural, but I can't be sure. Either way, I found it to be a strange and memorable experience, and so I'll share it with you now. At the time, I was working at a movie theater, and a lot of times would get off work between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. One such night, I was driving home. I remember it being a clear, warm summer night. The roads and sidewalks were empty, and I was in the suburbs nearing my home. I began slowing down for a stop sign that was in front of a church on my passenger side. I was very familiar with the church. This was my hometown, and I had passed this church countless times and had even been inside of it. As I began to slow to a halt, I noticed a figure on the front steps. This was a little strange because of the time of night, but as I started taking in details about this person, things got even stranger. The front of the church has just a small set of wide steps that lead to double doors. Above the doors is a large circular window that is made of stained glass, and it is illuminated beautifully at night. Standing at the top of these stairs in front of the doors was an elderly man wearing a newsboy-type cap. What I found to be peculiar, however, was that he was playing a violin. I don't remember hearing any music. I probably had some music or a radio on, or I might have had my windows rolled up. I can't remember. But as I slowed to a halt at the stop sign, the man slowly lowered the fiddle from his chin and looked right at me. Eventually, he had his violin and bow down at his sides, and although it was too dark to make out his face or his eyes, I could see his head following my car. Like I said, I don't know if this was a ghost, but there was something about this moment that had a supernatural air to it. It was like something out of a folktale, but at the same time, I remember being really creeped out. And although now I kind of wish I had stopped to talk to him or just to listen to the music he was playing, I did not stick around to take a closer look and pulled away from the stop sign as fast as I could and drove that last mile back to my house. I never saw him there again, although I passed that church, like I said, countless times on the way home from work around the same lonely hour. However, I did once find a complete fairy ring in front of the church. If you haven't heard of mushroom circles or fairy rings before, they are believed to be gateways leading to realms inhabited by fairies, and it is said if you step inside, you may be transported there. Sometimes fairies lure humans to their fairy rings with the sound of music. When they follow the music and find the fairies dancing merrily within the ring of mushrooms, the human who steps within the circle to join them is danced to their death. It is interesting to note as well that this church stood at several intersections, or a crossroads, a place where two roads meet and cross at right angles. And crossroads are known in all kinds of folklore to be an in-between place. And it is at these twixt and tween places that the veil is thin between realms. It is a place of great magic and great mystery. So, who knows what would have happened if I had stopped to listen to the music or to speak with the fiddler on the church steps. That's all I have for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed the variety of stories and topics. If anyone listening wants to share a story, please feel free to leave one in the comments or send me an email. The weirder, the better. It just has to be true. Until next time.